January 28th, 1547, in the dead of night at Whitehall Palace. A putrid, nauseating stench filled the royal chambers, so overwhelming that even the most hardened courtiers gagged and covered their faces with perfumed handkerchiefs. The smell was so powerful that it could be detected 3 rooms away. At the center of this horror lay what was once the most handsome prince in all of Europe, now a grotesque, 400-pound mass of rotting flesh, gasping his final breaths. This is the story of Henry VIII, the king who defied the Pope, married 6 wives, and executed 2 of them. But history books rarely tell you about his end. They don't describe the maggot-infested wounds that covered his legs, the cadaverous fluids that leaked from his still-living body, or the dogs that later lapped up the putrid substances that seeped from his coffin. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of history's most gruesome deaths. This isn't just about a king dying. This is about how absolute power, unchecked appetites, and human pride led to one of the most horrifying endings any monarch has ever suffered. Henry Tudor was born on June 28, 1491, and when he stepped onto the world stage as an 18-year-old king in 1509, he was absolutely magnificent. We're talking about a man who stood 6 feet, 2 inches tall, in an age when most men barely reached 5.5 feet. He had flowing golden red hair that caught the light like spun copper, piercing blue eyes, and a physique that would make modern athletes jealous. A Venetian ambassador wrote that Henry possessed an extraordinary figure and angelic countenance, superior in beauty to any other Christian prince in the world. This wasn't just royal propaganda. Henry was genuinely gifted. He could speak 4 languages fluently, compose music, write poetry, and was considered one of the finest athletes in Europe. He could joust with the best knights, wrestle any challenger to the ground, and dance until dawn without breaking a sweat. His waist measured a trim 35 inches, and he moved with the grace of a natural-born warrior. The young Henry wasn't just handsome. He was charismatic beyond belief. When he entered a room, conversations stopped. When he laughed, everyone wanted to be part of the joke. He had that rare combination of physical beauty, intellectual brilliance, and raw magnetism that made him seem almost superhuman to his subjects. For the first 25 years of his reign, Henry seemed untouchable. He was reshaping England, challenging the Catholic Church, and living life on his own terms. But fate has a way of humbling even the mightiest, and for Henry VIII, that humbling would come in the most brutal way imaginable. January 24th, 1536, was when Henry VIII's transformation from golden god to rotting corpse truly began. The king was 44 years old and still competing in jousting tournaments, despite being well past the age when most knights hung up their armor. At the Greenwich tournament, Henry was thundering down the lists on his massive warhorse, lance leveled at his opponent. These weren't gentle sporting events. Knights were charging at each other at full speed with 12-foot wooden lances, wearing 60 pounds of steel armor. One mistake could be fatal. And that's exactly what happened. Henry's horse, Izzy Beast, weighing over 1,500 pounds, stumbled and crashed to the ground with devastating force. The king, trapped in his heavy armor, was crushed beneath the animal's massive weight. Witnesses said the ground shook with the impact. For 2 terrifying hours, Henry VIII lay unconscious. His courtiers gathered around, whispering prayers and preparing for the possibility that England might lose its king. When he finally came to, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. The king was alive, conscious, and seemingly intact. But they had no idea what horror was about to unfold. The fall had done severe damage to Henry's right leg. What seemed like a simple injury at first refused to heal. Within weeks, it had become an open, weeping ulcer that would plague him for the rest of his life. And I mean plague him. This wasn't just a wound that bothered him occasionally. This was a constantly festering, pus-filled crater in his leg that would grow larger and more putrid with each passing year. The smell was indescribable. Imagine the worst thing you've ever smelled, then multiply it by 10. Courtiers had to steel themselves before entering the king's presence, and many couldn't hide their revulsion, despite knowing it could cost them their heads. Henry, who had once announced his arrival with fanfare and pageantry, now announced his presence with a wave of nauseating stench that preceded him wherever he went. But the physical wound was just the beginning. Some historians believe the jousting accident caused brain damage that fundamentally altered Henry's personality. The timing is suspicious. It was during this same period that he ordered the execution of Anne Boleyn, his second wife, on trumped-up charges of adultery and treason. The paranoia, the explosive rages, the increasingly erratic behavior, they all seemed to intensify after that January day in 1536. With his mobility severely limited by the leg injury, Henry began a transformation that shocked anyone who knew him in his prime. The athletic king who once danced for hours and wrestled with his courtiers was now largely confined to his chambers, and his body began expanding at an alarming rate. His waist, which had measured a trim 35 inches in his youth, began to balloon. By 1540, royal tailors were crafting doublets for a 42-inch waist. By 1545, it had reached an incredible 52 inches. But the numbers don't tell the full story of just how massive Henry had become. Picture a man so enormous that normal doorways had to be widened to accommodate his bulk. Palace architects were literally redesigning royal residences around the king's expanding girth. When Henry needed to move between floors, servants operated a specially designed pulley system to hoist his immense frame up staircases. The man who had once leaped onto horses in full armor now needed mechanical assistance just to get out of bed. His weight ballooned to over 400 pounds, making him a genuinely terrifying sight. But it wasn't just the size, it was what that size represented. Every pound was evidence of Henry's complete loss of self-control, his surrender to the most basic human appetites. And speaking of appetites, let's talk about Henry's eating habits during this period, because they were absolutely staggering. Kitchen records from the time show that the king was consuming approximately 5,000 calories per day, more than twice what an active man his size should eat. But Henry wasn't active anymore. He was essentially sedentary, which meant every one of those calories was adding to his bulk. A typical dinner for Henry would make a modern competitive eater blanch. We're talking about multiple meat pies, each the size of a dinner plate, whole roasted chickens, beef roasts, pork joints, game birds, all washed down with enormous quantities of wine and beer. Contemporary accounts describe meals where Henry would consume what should have fed a family of 6. Vegetables were almost entirely absent from his diet. The man was essentially living on red meat, white bread, and alcohol. It's no wonder his body began breaking down in spectacular fashion. But the leg ulcer wasn't healing in fact, it was getting progressively worse. By 1540, physicians were describing wounds so deep that bone was visible through the decomposing flesh. The king's legs had become landscapes of horror, covered in open sores that refused to close despite the most advanced medical treatments of the time. Now, when I say advanced medical treatments, you have to understand that 16th century medicine was often more horrifying than the conditions it was trying to treat. Henry's physicians were subjecting him to procedures that we now know were not just useless, but actively harmful. They regularly cauterized his wounds with red-hot iron rods, essentially burning away infected flesh in an attempt to promote healing. Can you imagine the agony? The King of England, lying on his bed while physicians pressed glowing metal against his open wounds, the smell of burning flesh mixing with the already overwhelming stench of infection. But that wasn't the worst of it. His doctors were also applying poultices containing arsenic and mercury substances we now know are deadly poisons. They were literally poisoning the king while trying to heal him. These toxic treatments were absorbed through his open wounds directly into his bloodstream, slowly destroying his organs from the inside. And then there was the bloodletting. Medieval physicians believed that draining bad blood from the body would restore balance and promote healing. So multiple times per week, they would open veins in Henry's arms and drain pints of blood from his already weakened body. This left him increasingly pale, weak, and susceptible to further infection. The combination of these treatments created a vicious cycle. The cauterization damaged healthy tissue around the wounds, making them larger. The arsenic and mercury poisoned his system, preventing natural healing. The bloodletting weakened his immune system, making him more vulnerable to the very infections they were trying to treat. By 1545, Henry's legs were essentially rotting while he was still alive. Witnesses described wounds so extensive that you could see straight through to the bone. The flesh around the ulcers had turned black and green, and the smell had become so overwhelming that servants had to be rotated regularly because they couldn't endure prolonged exposure. But here's the truly horrifying part. Henry was fully conscious through all of this. His mind remained sharp enough to understand exactly what was happening to his body. He could see the horror in people's faces when they looked at him. He could smell his own decomposition, and he knew that there was nothing his wealth, power, or royal status could do to stop it. The psychological torture of this realization drove him to increasingly erratic behavior. The king, who had once been known for his wit and charm, became paranoid, suspicious, and violent. He began executing close friends and loyal advisors on the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. The court, already horrified by the king's physical condition, now lived in constant terror of his unpredictable rages. In the midst of this physical and mental deterioration, Henry continued his desperate search for happiness through marriage. In 1540, at age 49, he married Catherine Howard, a young woman of just 19. The age gap alone was shocking, but when you consider Henry's condition, this union becomes genuinely disturbing. Imagine being a 19-year-old girl forced to share a bed with a 400-pound man whose body was literally rotting. The smell alone would have been unbearable, but Catherine was expected to perform her wifely duties with enthusiasm and grace. Contemporary accounts suggest that she found the situation so revolting that she sought comfort elsewhere. When Catherine's affair was discovered, Henry's reaction was swift and brutal. Both Catherine and her lover were executed. Another reminder that even in his weakened state, the king's capacity for cruelty remained intact. His final marriage, to Catherine Parr in 1543, was less about romance than survival. Catherine essentially became Henry's nurse, tending to his wounds and managing his increasingly complex medical needs. She showed remarkable courage, considering the fate of her predecessors, and managed to outlive the king, though only barely. By 1546, Henry VIII was no longer really governing England. He was barely surviving from day to day, trapped in a body that had become his own personal hell. The ulcers on his legs had developed gangrene, and the infection was spreading throughout his system. The smell emanating from the king's apartments was now so powerful that it could be detected throughout entire wings of the palace. Courtiers would soak handkerchiefs in perfume and hold them over their faces when forced to attend the king. But even this provided little relief from the overwhelming stench of decay. Henry's paranoia reached new heights during this period. He became obsessed with the possibility of poisoning, implementing elaborate food testing protocols that turned every meal into a lengthy ceremony. Every dish had to be tasted by multiple servants before it reached the king's table. Every utensil was inspected for signs of tampering. This wasn't entirely irrational, given his treatment of others. Henry had good reason to fear assassination attempts. His mental state deteriorated along with his physical condition. Witnesses reported that the king would alternate between periods of agonizing pain, during which he would scream curses at anyone within earshot, and moments of deep depression when he would stare silently for hours. During his delirious episodes, he was often heard murmuring the names of his deceased wives, particularly Jane Seymour, the only one who had given him a male heir, and Anne Boleyn, whose execution may have haunted his final days. The winter of 1546 to 47 was particularly brutal. Henry's breathing became increasingly labored as infections spread throughout his body. He was running constant fevers, probably due to septicemia from the numerous infected wounds. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. Nobody at court was allowed to acknowledge that the king was dying. English law considered it treason to predict the monarch's death. So physicians and courtiers were forced to maintain the pretense that Henry might recover, even as the smell of decomposition filled the royal chambers. On January 27, 1547, Henry finally allowed Archbishop Thomas Cranmer to be summoned to his bedside. The king could no longer speak, but when asked if he died in the Christian faith, he managed to squeeze Cranmer's hand, his final conscious act. In the early hours of January 28th, at 55 years of age, Henry VIII exhaled his last breath. But even death couldn't end the indignity of his condition. Due to his enormous size, a special coffin had to be constructed to contain his remains. The royal embalmers faced a horrifying challenge. How do you preserve a body that had been essentially decomposing for years while the person was still alive? 16th century embalming was primitive at best, involving little more than removing the internal organs and stuffing the body cavities with aromatic herbs. Given Henry's condition, this process was woefully inadequate. While the body awaited the state funeral, one of the most macabre episodes in royal history occurred. The coffin, inadequately sealed to contain the gases and fluids of decomposition, began to leak while resting in the chapel at Sion Abbey. During the night, cadaverous fluid trickled onto the chapel floor. When morning came, the scene that greeted the horrified clergy was straight out of a nightmare. Stray dogs had somehow entered the chapel and were lapping up the putrid substances that had leaked from the king's coffin. Think about the symbolism of that moment. The man who had declared himself head of the Church of England, who had defied the Pope and redefined Christianity in his realm, whose body had once been admired throughout Europe as the pinnacle of royal magnificence. That same body was now being violated by street animals. The funeral finally took place on February 16th, 1547, almost 3 weeks after Henry's death. Despite the unbearable smell emanating from the coffin, the ceremonies were conducted with all the pomp expected for such a powerful monarch. But everyone present knew they were burying a horror, not a hero. Henry VIII's death serves as one of history's most powerful reminders that no amount of wealth, power, or royal privilege can exempt us from the fundamental realities of human existence. The king, who had rewritten the laws of his nation to satisfy his desires, discovered that he couldn't rewrite the laws of nature. His transformation from Europe's most handsome prince to a rotting mass of flesh represents more than just a medical tragedy. It's a moral tale about the dangers of unchecked power and unlimited appetite. The man who had controlled the fate of millions couldn't control his own body's decay. Perhaps most ironically, the king who broke with Rome and executed 2 wives in his desperate quest for a male heir would be succeeded by his daughters, particularly Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman he had murdered on false charges. In the end, Henry VIII's horrible death reminds us that regardless of our achievements or social position, we all face the same inevitable fate. But few of us will face it quite so grotesquely as the king who thought himself above the laws of God and nature. The stench has long since faded from those palace chambers, but the lesson remains: absolute power corrupts absolutely, and even kings must answer to the ultimate authority, mortality itself.